set? Okay. All right, folks, let's get the show on the road, as they say. We are beginning a course in ethics, and this, of course, is one of the several sciences within philosophy. It is not the first science which one studies in philosophy, and really there are a number of things that one has to presuppose in order to properly do ethics. If this were the typical college course in ethics, I guess what you would be doing is coming in and having one of these shows like you have with Oprah or any of the talk shows where people just say whatever's on their mind, and ultimately it's a matter of opinion and everybody can go this way or that way because there really is no scientific foundation to any ethical judgment. So basically your judgment's as good as mine, and what is moral is whatever I guess we put to a vote, as we're finding out in New York State this evening. But morality is not just a matter of voting. It is the product of a scientific judgment which is based upon a framework, and a framework which is not founded within ethics itself. You can't just do ethics. You can't just do ethics by itself. Ethics is in a context. If you can't answer certain basic questions, you're in no position to answer the questions about what is morally right or morally wrong. One of the first questions you have to answer is, what does it mean to be a human being? As far as I know, cockroaches don't have ethical systems. We do. So what makes us different? That we are, you might say, ethical animals. And that's, of course, why we have an entire course called Philosophical Psychology, which is the one that we not long ago completed. You have to know, what does man have a nature? What is the nature of man? Where do we come from and where are we going? If you can't answer those questions, again, it's very difficult to answer the question as to what sorts of things we ought to do. Also, we presuppose metaphysics, because metaphysics addresses the question of what is the context in which we find human beings. If human beings are simply the end product of a few billion years of mindless evolution, the question of what is right or wrong for man is going to be answered in an entirely different way than were we to say that man is the product of an intelligent creator, a personal creator. Very different context. So this course presupposes that one is aware of the structure of reality that's dictated by philosophical psychology, by metaphysics, to some extent by epistemology, and therefore the course does not exist in a vacuum. I have been teaching the course since about 1990, and I should give you a little bit of the background here, because the fact of the matter is I've handed, or you will be receiving, a number of notes that were derived from my course, and I just want you to know that I'm really giving you something that was very much originated in the hands of Dr. Rayful Waters. When I was a graduate student at the University of Notre Dame, longer ago than I'm willing to admit, I did have a doctoral minor in ethics. And when I began teaching, although I didn't teach the undergrad course in ethics, I did teach a couple graduate courses in ethics over the years. But when you're doing that, to some extent, you're kind of picking and choosing certain segments or parts of ethics. I believe one of them had to do with certain special questions in ethics, which are very interesting. But one of the things that I had not really been much exposed to since I left the University of Detroit many, many years ago, and that was a systematic scientific organization of the courses in philosophy. That's something that Dr. Waters always insisted upon, and which some of us members of the department strongly urged and supported for many, many years in our teaching career. And it's a very important thing, because in many schools today, you'll find, for example, in Catholic schools, concern to follow the magisterium of the church, which is certainly laudable. And I recall having something of a conversation, probably for almost an hour, with Father Joseph Fessio about precisely the question of what kind of teachers they would be hiring as professors at Ave Maria University in Florida. And I strongly urged him to the extent he was able to, which of course he wasn't, to assure that the program and the system and the courses would be taught in a scientific, systematic way. And he told me that the only concern he really had at this point was to make sure that they got professors who were faithful to the magisterium. Well, I have no doubt that a Catholic school ought to be teaching what the Catholic Church teaches. But our experience has been that if at the same time you do not make sure that you're giving systematic scientific courses, eventually the entire program tends to degenerate into a more historical orientation and tends to move in the direction of historicism and relativism. This is most unfortunate. I mean, it would be the same thing as if you were to teach, say, St. Thomas Aquinas, but do it purely from the standpoint of an historical presentation. That is not really what philosophy is about, nor theology. Philosophy and theology, just like the other disciplines, are sciences or groups of sciences. And as such, there are systematic methods and proper ways of expounding and presenting the material that is contained therein. You don't automatically start at the very top of the ladder in any discipline. And that's really what people are doing when they jump into ethics courses and approach it as a debating society with nobody really having any background. And of course, that's one of the reasons why everybody thinks he's an ethician. You know, as Rodney Dangerfield says, we don't get no respect. At 3 o'clock in the morning, everybody thinks he's capable of doing ethics, especially when he's falling off a bar stool. I don't see anybody saying they could do neurosurgery. You know, they know that takes some degree of preparation, but they think ethics doesn't. Well, ethics does. It's a science. It's a discipline. And really, my own background was that in 1989, I took a sabbatical where I wound up starting my book, Origin of Human Species. But at the same time, because I had the semester off, I just sat in on Dr. Waters' course in ethics. And as a result, two things emerged. One, pretty much the set of notes that I've had will be distributed to you through this course, and also in my own mind, a more firm understanding of the proper organization of the material. You can always pick up a textbook and you do see the organization, but you really have to kind of sit through a course which is presented in that fashion before you fully appreciate the importance of approaching this in a systematic way. So that's what we're going to try to do here. And that means at the outset, I have the same problem, I suppose, or at least I have to assume that I do, although many of you have been with me through the philosophical psychology and a lot of the metaphysics and the proofs for God's existence, which we just completed. When I began these courses in university, although the students supposedly had had an introductory course in philosophy, I had to presume they knew nothing, because that's about what they knew. The introductory course, because it attempts to cover so many historical positions and systems, basically covers none of them very well, and certainly does not give you the kind of foundations that would be requisite for the development of the kind of ethics that we find in Aristotle or St. Thomas. So in starting this course, I'm going to do the same sort of thing that I did in my undergraduate courses, and that is try to take a few minutes to establish the most fundamental criteria that we need to know about human nature and about the question of whether there is a supreme being before we launch into this, because otherwise it's sort of like having a part of a picture, but you don't even have the rest of the picture, much less the frame that surrounds the picture. So the first thing that I'm going to do, let's just pick up on your first page of notes where it says point number 1, ethics, and it gives a definition. And you'll notice it says, read Higgins, The Science and Art of Ethics, otherwise entitled Man as Man. That was a textbook that we were using in university, and it was sold by 10 publishers. I suspect they've still got a bunch of them because they ordered about 2,000 of them, even though we tried to dissuade them from doing it because we knew they'd never get them all sold. Certainly not through us, and there weren't many other colleges using it. But if you happen upon a copy of it, all well and good. It's pretty thick reading. I remember running into one of the students who was graduating one day, and the last thing he did before he left the campus was to give me his copy of this book. So I knew that he wasn't about to read it the rest of his life. But anyway, ethics is the philosophical science. We're going to come back to these points later on. First of all, it's philosophical. Now, of course, that means it's not religious. It's not pastoral theology. It's not based upon anybody's private belief system. It is based upon reason, because philosophy is a discipline of reason. It is a philosophy. It is a seeking the ultimate answers to ultimate questions about the nature of man, about the nature of reality, and about the structure of the world in relation to a possible creator. It is a science. And science, if you recall, means from the Latin scire, to know, to really know something. It isn't just a matter of opinion, it's not a matter of assumptions. To really know something, as Aristotle says, means you have to know that it's true, you have to know why it is true, and you have to know why it cannot be otherwise. And thereby he defines the nature of what we call the scientific syllogism. So when you have science, you really know what you're talking about, you can give the reasons for it, and you can ultimately ground those reasons either in immediate experience or self-evident first principles that are known universally because the human mind naturally understands that they must be true. It's a philosophical science of the necessary good. In other words, what's got to be good about what? Human acts. The term human act specifically refers to those acts for which we are responsible. When you say a human act, you're talking about a deliberate act. You're talking about a free act, an act that you have control over. Scratching your nose when it itches may be the act of a human being, but it's not necessarily a human act, because you may do it without any deliberation whatever. Sneezing is the act of a human being, but it's not a human act in this sense because it's not deliberate. But taking out a bank loan would presumably be a human act because you think about it, you deliberate it, and then you finally do it freely. And again, a lot of notions here that have to be more carefully explained, as I'm sure you realize. It is a practical science. It has to do with doing things. It has to do with getting something done. It deals with how we live in our ordinary everyday life. It is a normative science. Norm meaning laying down a rule. It establishes what ought to be. Not norm in the sense of normal, meaning something that's done all the time, because there's a lot of things done all the time that are not terribly normal. We're about to institutionalize some of them, I guess. That is to say, how man ought to act in practice so as to attain true happiness. people will often say, well, if you ask them, what do you want to do in life, or what do you want out of life, you get a million different answers. But there's something I know every one of you want. I can predict it. You don't have to put it to a vote. It's absolutely certain. And I can put it in a negative tone and you'll understand. How many of you don't want to be happy? Say, put your hand up. How many of you want to be miserable? Nobody wants to be miserable. We want to be happy. Everybody wants to be happy. You can't help it. So some people say, well, if you ask them, what do you want in life? They'll say, well, I want a lot of money. Or I want a lot of power. I want a lot of land. I want to have a lot of free time. I want to not have to work for a living. Okay? I want to chase every member of the opposite sex I can find. Or the same in some cases. But you see, in every case, what that entails is seeking something that you think will make you happy. People disagree about the means, because in large measure they often disagree about or don't understand what it means to be a human being. So we really do have to understand that. In the previous course, the philosophical psychology, we talked about what it meant to be a human being, and we recognized that there are radically different ways of looking at this. From the standpoint of the materialist, man is simply a highly developed animal, and that's the end of the game. There's no more to him. And that's why, and we'll discuss this in greater length at a later point, that's why I would suggest that from a materialist standpoint, there really isn't any basis for ethics. What do you mean by ethics? What do you mean by saying something's morally right or wrong? I would argue and staunchly defend that a materialist has no basis for saying anything is ethically right or ethically wrong. There is no basis for right or wrong. If you're nothing but a pile of atoms, tell me which atom determines what part of you is right or wrong, morally speaking. Does sodium have prevalence over chlorine? Do cockroaches have moral superiority over worms, or vice versa? In a really materialistic environment or world, I would suggest everything is flat. Everything's at the same level. Everything's nothing but a bunch of atoms, if that's where you take it down to. You can go deeper, of course. But everything's reduced to whatever the ultimate foundations of matter are, and you can rearrange it, you can reconvene it, you can structure it in this or that way, but ultimately you don't add anything to its values because it has no value to begin with. And human life has no particular value, and in fact, of course, that is what we are seeing today, isn't it? In a secular society where everything is reduced to a materialistic value, even human life has no value, either preborn or approaching the grave, or in between for that matter. Conscience has no value. Sexuality has no value. Sexuality today is interpreted as meaning basically you can do anything you want. And if you want it, you got a right to do it. And that's why we see, with reference to the contentions over same-sex marriage, as I read in one place, marriage equality trumps individual conscience. Marriage equality trumps individual conscience. What happened to religious values? What happened to the notion, which once was primary in the United States, that religious freedom was preeminent? It was a primary value. Some 20 or 30 years ago, the courts subtly shifted religious rights to being a secondary value. And that's where it is now. And that's why you see secular values such as absolute equality of everything, including sexual behavior, trumps religious rights or values or even the individual conscience. And that's why I would predict what is going to be enacted in New York State tonight. They said I'm sure we're going to enact same-sex marriage, and they said that they will put some exemptions on it to protect religious organizations. What I want to know, and I'm willing to bet you anything you want, they will not put an exemption in, I hope to heaven I'm wrong, they will not put an exemption in to protect individual conscience. Because you see, that's the ball game. If you're going to say that the same-sex marriage is genuine marriage, then individual conscience has to step aside. There is no way the individual can possibly resist that. And that's why you have in Massachusetts, where they have already had this on the books for a couple years now, in the public schools, you have the children being indoctrinated to accept role models of same-sex marriage as being normal. That's what they will do and will have to do and will be forced to do, probably also in New York State, for the same reason. Because if something is normal, if it's sanctioned by law, it is normal and therefore it is right. And if it is right, you have no right not to educate children about it, you see. So this is the difficulty that society gets into. There really isn't a place for compromise on some issues, just like abortion. How do you compromise about whether you kill unborn children? What is the halfway point? Will you tell me? You're only going to cut them half and half? No. This is not Solomon's day. This is something where there is no halfway position. And there's no halfway position between society sanctioning and saying that something is a reality and still allowing people the freedom to opt out of participating in it in some way or other. You're always told initially you won't have to participate, but we're all old enough and experienced enough to know that isn't how it works, does it? First place you participate is with your tax dollars immediately, and that never ends. So anyway, what I was getting at is, from a purely materialist standpoint, there really isn't any basis for ethical values. And if somebody wonders, is that truly the case, I would even address the point that one cannot even be an atheist and have ethical values. Atheists will fight tooth and nail to say, I'm an atheist, but I've got principles. The difficulty is, sure, you've got principles, but whose principles are they? They're your principles, because you espouse them. You can give any reason for them you want. You can say, well, they conform to human nature. That's almost Aristotelian. Fine, but why do you think you have to conform to human nature? If man is the be-all and end-all, then if you choose not to conform to human nature, that's your choice. And this is why, unless there is a God to whom man is responsible, answerable, then ultimately there is no sanction for our behavior. That's why Dostoevsky said, if there is no God, if there is no heaven, if there is no hell, then anything is permissible. You can't say anything is wrong. Again, we'll play with these notions a little bit more as we proceed, but this is why the framework matters. And this is why we have to address initially this question of what is the nature of man. If you could look back at your notes. Man is defined here as a rational animal, that's following Aristotle, a rational animal having thereby a spiritual and immortal soul manifested by intellect and will. Now we know that from philosophical psychology, don't we? Because we just completed that course. But I'm sure that some people who may listen to this in the future may not have had exposure to the course. So the same problem I had with my undergraduate students, how do we very quickly get some understanding of what the nature of man is and the context in which he finds himself? Because notice that the next point says, God is the ultimate, efficient, and final cause of all creation. Creatures attain God as their last end by fulfilling their natures, which is the divine intention. Now, how can you just start out ethics and address these issues and not give some kind of substantive foundation for them? But at the same time, we can't repeat the course in philosophical psychology, nor can we repeat metaphysics. So what are we going to do? This was a problem I always had on the first day of my ethics course, especially looking at students who had far less preparation than most of you already have. Well, one way I approached it is this. I would just start out, and I'll admit this is, I'm doing this a little bit with some context of presumption, but something which I think we can draw a universal agreement to with great vehemence, and that is, let me ask you this question. Has there ever been anybody anytime, any place that you can think of who's done something that you think they really should have gotten punished for? Or are you willing to give absolutely everybody a pass for anything? No. Hitler, Tojo, Stalin, Mao Zedong, going to give them all a pass. You've never in your life experienced anybody who did something where you thought, that dirty rat, why did he do that? This really, that's a horrible thing to do. Makes me think of the psychiatrist who once mentioned he'd been trained that when you're listening to what these patients come in, you're not supposed to be judgmental about them. And finally he said, is this getting through to me? Because these are horrible people and they've done horrible things, and I'm supposed to sit there and not think anything about it. It is the common experience of mankind that there are horrible people, and they do horrible things. It's like the death penalty. Everybody says, we don't need the death penalty, shouldn't have it. New York shouldn't have it. And then all of a sudden somebody does something so horrendous, and we say, well, what can we do to them? And say, well, give them life without parole. Oh, is that all? Maybe we should have the death penalty. So for a few days people get all hot under the collar about it, but it goes away again until somebody else does something absolutely appalling. So I leave it to you. Would you be willing to grant that nobody ever does anything for which they ought not be, in some sense, held responsible? Because you see, that's really the position you're in if you're a materialist. You should never logically hold anybody responsible for anything. When the dog comes up and bites the postman, we say, get down, you bad dog, but we don't really hold the dog that responsible. But if the person he's delivering the letter to bites him, then we view that differently. So we do hold people responsible for something, but you see, the logic of holding someone responsible is to say they didn't have to do it. They could have done something different. If they could have done something different, do you know what you just bought into, big time, without all the metaphysics behind it? They had to be what?
Free.
They had to be free. You just accepted freedom. If you really don't believe in freedom, and materialists shouldn't, if they're logical, you always find people that are very illogical. If you really don't believe in freedom, you ought to never hold anybody responsible for anything. If we're sending people to jail, we ought to make it a country club for everybody, because after all, they couldn't help what they did. Don't make things rough for them just because you're trying to protect society from the serial killer. He ought to have a country club estate to live on with all kinds of servants to take care of him. In fact, we owe it to him because we're restricting his physical freedom. We ought to give him something in return. But of course, why ought we do anything in a materialist world? Where do you get the ought from? Ought? You ought to do this? What does that mean? Why ought I do anything? Why ought not I do anything? Again, that comes back to Dostoevsky. Why shouldn't I chop your head off? You see, I'm sure anybody defending materialism would resist the suggestion that I have the right to cut his head off. And of course, the whole problem is there's no basic for the concept of right either. How can you have a right to anything, including marriage, if you are materialist by nature? You see, what we're doing is we're walking down two entirely different universes. And these universes are mixed in our society. Those who logically have no basis for believing in anything, in any value, in any truth, in any certitude. And if you push them far enough, they really don't. They're relativists who ultimately espouse no principle or value except that which they themselves hold for now. That's one way of looking at the world. The other way recognizes that man is superior to other animals, that we do have certain values to our nature, a dignity, a responsibility, a freedom, an obligation that isn't found in the land of the cockroaches. And that as such, this is a completely different universe that we're living in. If we are free beings, I take that as a given assumption for this course. Because after all, if we're not free beings, let's just fold up and leave. How can you have a course in ethics if we're not free? How can you say what we ought to do? How can you have an ought when you have no control over whether you obey it or not? You see, there's no basis for ethics. Get over it. Ethics presupposes that man is free. And if man is free, you've got another problem, and that is that material things are not free. A materialistic metaphysics has no place for anything but determinism. I realize I'm saying some things that if this was a course in metaphysics or phil psych, I'd spend a lot more time developing it. So to some extent, I'm relying upon your own natural intuitive abilities to see that in a purely materialistic, mechanical world, there is no such thing as freedom. Which means that by man having freedom, he has already transcended the material order of things. By man having freedom, he is above, qualitatively superior to all lower creatures that are not free. I know you may think your pet Doberman is free. I don't know. I'm not going to argue the point, but I would say this. Whatever creatures are free are essentially superior to the ones that are just material. And that means we have to ask if there's something in them, a life principle, which makes them that different from material things. Where does it come from? In other words, some would talk about this as the soul. In traditional Aristotelian terms, we'd be talking about the possession of a soul which is not material, which is spiritual. And our problem is this. Atoms don't have these. Cockroaches, roaches don't have them. Carrots don't have them. Horses don't have them. It looks like, though, human beings do, because we are free beings and we have this life principle which entails freedom, and freedom entails understanding what you do. So that's where you get the intellection. Freedom and understanding. Lower beings don't have this. Where does it come from? It can't come from matter alone. And here's the problem. Do you inherit it from your parents? Your parents have this intellectual, free life principle, but it isn't something they can convey by the generative act. So where does it come from? Every time a human being comes into being, suddenly appears this spiritual center. I would use the word soul now. The spiritual soul. Where does it come from? You can't get it from pre-existent matter because matter doesn't have it. So what does it take to suddenly make it present when it wasn't there before? What you're really looking at, I would suggest, is a creative act. Something, some agent, is actually creating in man this spiritual faculty, this spiritual essence or form. Creating because you can't get it out of matter. Matter doesn't have it to give, and yet it suddenly appears. How much power does it take to create? See, that's not something, can you measure it? To go from nothing to something? Again, that could be the subject of a couple classes by itself, but intuitively, people realize that that takes unlimited power to create. Unlimited power. That, of course, is why the materialist for a long time resisted the Big Bang Theory, because they didn't want to have the world coming into being out of nothing. They knew what that meant. They didn't want any part of it. But here, every time a human being comes into being, his soul comes into being out of nothing. And we have the same problem. If it takes infinite power to create the cosmos out of nothing, it takes equal power to create anything out of nothing, because you got nothing to work with. materialist says, I can explain the whole world. We just take the dust and move it all around and we produce what we've got. I can do what you can do, God. So God says, okay, you make the dust. See, that's the problem. You got to explain the stuff that you're going to play with first. Where do you get it from? And when you're dealing with a spiritual entity like the human spiritual soul, you got no place to get it from in the material universe. And it takes unlimited power to create, which means you got some agent that has unlimited power. Can you have limited power in a limited being? Can you have limited power in a limited being? Obviously, the power cannot exceed the being of the agent that has the power. So you've got to have an unlimited being. You've got to have an infinite being.
Did you mean to say, can you have unlimited power in a limited being?
I meant to say, can you have, yeah, I did. Can you have unlimited power proceeding from a limited being?
I didn't hear it properly.
Right. You can't. It takes infinite power to create. It takes an infinite being to have infinite power. And an infinite being, incidentally, little basic metaphysics, you can't give what you do not have. What this being is creating when this being makes a rational, understanding, freely choosing being, which we are, since you can't give what you don't have, this being, this infinite agent, infinite being must possess understanding and will to give it to us. And beings that have understanding and will are what we call persons. Therefore, you need an infinite, personal, spiritual agent to produce the spiritual free souls of human beings in the world every day. In other words, you need God. So here, what I'm trying to do is establish very quickly our framework. You have a human nature which is free and rational and spiritual, and you have a free, spiritual, infinite, personal God who creates our soul every time we come into being. And it doesn't take too much imagination to realize that this infinite, personal God is responsible for the rest of the world, which the materialist refuses to give him credit for. And of course, just to put something on the other end of it, if we are spiritual beings, then clearly when the body corrupts, our spiritual soul is not going to corrupt because the spiritual is not dependent on the material. So there you've got an afterlife. So we have the outlines of what you would have to slowly develop in philosophical psychology, where you would demonstrate step by step the spirituality, the immortality, the nature of the human soul, the human person, and in metaphysics, where you would demonstrate the existence and the nature of God as a supreme, creative, personal being. Okay, any questions so far? We just did phil psych and metaphysics. As I say, I have to do that the first day in my undergraduate courses, and ethics doesn't exist in a vacuum. You have to establish these things. Otherwise, you have no ethics. You have no basis for ethics. I mean, if I were conducting a class of chimpanzees, it would be a real short course in ethics. We might have to discuss how to divide up the bananas, but that's about it. But human existence, human life, is far more complex. Some of the things that we learn in philosophical psychology have to be applied in this discipline. For example, the nature of man, we'll have to some extent presuppose what you know from phil psych, to understand the sensitive, the emotional parts of man, to understand the interplay between the intellect and the will and the senses and the emotions, and to understand, for example, that man is a creature of habit. What is the nature of a habit? How does it affect ethical behavior? All of these things come into place. Let's go back and look at the lines that we just covered and plug them into what I just developed. The nature of man is a rational animal having, because he's rational, a spiritual and immortal soul, manifested by intellect and will. We just did that.
What's the understanding of rational in this statement?
Rational in the sense, well, actually, to be rational entails the ability to understand. But when we use the term rational in the case of man, it involves a process of reasoning, because we don't have angelic intellects or divine intellects where we just instantly understand everything. We have to go from one thing that we know to another thing that we conclude by means of a third thing, which we call a middle term. We engage in a process of reasoning. And that's why we're not born knowing everything, but we have to learn and experience and then build our knowledge step by step. But we are reasoning beings, as unlike our pet pooches that do not have rationality. They have instinct, they have sensation, they have memory, they have association of images and many other things, but they don't have what we call rationality. We are true animals. Anima, remember, is the Greek word, or the Latin word for mind or soul, and it is the principle of life, which animates, we said, like animated characters, or the animals in the zoo. It's the principle that makes them to be alive. We share with other animals that principle of life, but what makes us different is we have the capacity to understand and to reason and to judge and to choose freely, which they don't. And of course, the spiritual and immortal character of the soul is manifested by, it is proven by, in other words, the fact that we have intellect and will and the operations of intellect and will. Again, much of that is properly developed in philosophical psychology. I just attempted this evening to short circuit a lot of it. God is the ultimate efficient cause, that's the making cause, of all creation. The final cause, now that's another issue which needs a little bit more development, because we haven't even talked about what a final cause is. But the end of all creation, creatures attain God as their last end. How? By fulfilling their natures. Now what's a nature? Nature, actually it's from the Greek physis. Aristotle wrote a book called The Physics. We talk about physics today. Well, physics is derived from the Greek word for nature. So all that you're studying in physics is nature. And what is nature? Well, the definition's a little bit tricky. It's the first principle of motion and rest in that in which it is. Aristotle spends a horrible length of time in the first couple paragraphs of Book 1 of the Physics explaining what nature is. We take it as a given. You say, well, I'm studying the natural sciences. I learn all about nature in the natural sciences. Good. You tell me, a natural scientist, who will tell you what the word nature means. They presuppose it. They say we study the nature of things by observing their activity. But find me a textbook, a good textbook in physics, biology, or chemistry, where there's a definition for nature. Nature is so primitive, so basic, so fundamental that we either intuitively know what it is, or you've got to come up with a very convoluted definition such as Aristotle does. The first principle of motion and rest. In other words, it's the first thing in anything that explains why it behaves the way it does. You can't just have it behaving a certain way, like a bird flying all the time, without there being something in the bird to make it be a flyable being. And that's its nature, to fly, to be able to fly. See, that's where we get the notion of nature.
I thought I read somewhere that definition of nature is that which makes a thing what it is, or something.
Well, all right, that's.
But you're defining it more like what it does.
Yeah, it's sometimes defined as essence from the point of view of activity, but it's through the activity that we know the nature of a thing. But what we're always seeking to find out in science of any type is the nature of nature, the nature of things. That's why Sir Arthur Eddington in 1931 wrote a book entitled "The Nature of the Physical Universe," one of the leading physicists, but it's all about nature. And you see on TV documentaries entitled Nature. You know, we always want to know the nature of things. Well, we need to understand the nature of man. Because if we understand human nature, then we can begin to answer the question of, well, you know, what should we do in order to be happy? If we want to know how to be happy, we've got to know the difference between ourselves and a mud puddle. Because what might be good for a mud puddle might not be good for us. All that rain today would have been good for a mud puddle. Might not be good for us. We have to know what kind of a being we are in order to know what's good for us. And of course, we also have to discuss what do we mean by the good. See, there's a lot of terms in here. Creatures attain God as their last end or purpose by fulfilling their natures. If you fulfill your nature, you attain a certain degree of perfection. Now we say somebody's in good shape. You measure their physical well-being by how healthy they are. And of course, if their nature to have certain qualities and characteristics and specifications of good health, if that's lacking, if they've deviated from their nature with respect to their health, they are bad. We say, you're in bad health, right? Well, no, you don't want to hear that. Finally, it says, which is the divine intention. God, as I don't want to say rational, but intellective being, just as we do things deliberately, God creates deliberately. God is not insane. He creates deliberately. He has made us a certain way. Whenever we make something a certain way, we do it for a purpose. Because we always think in terms of purpose. The intellect is always seeking a certain end before we act. Anytime we deliberate and then set out and do something, we're trying to accomplish some end. It doesn't mean that God does it quite the same we do, because we've got to realize there's an analogous barrier between us and God in that sense. But it does mean that when God creates, he has in mind a certain intention. And if you want to know what that intention is, the best way to read it is to examine human nature and try to figure out what is the way in which it is best fulfilled. In other words, what's according to our nature, what is not according to our nature. And that is the measure of what we call natural law. It's not purely arbitrary. And frankly, there's only two kinds of ethics I know of. One is what we call natural law ethics, and the rest is, I have no idea what it is. Because whatever it is, it sure isn't ethics. And you can't pin it down because it's not pinned down to anything. The only way to determine what is morally good for man is by looking at man. The measure of mankind is man himself. And so we're going to be doing in this course a lot of looking at our nature in order to try to understand what measures the perfection of our being, knowing that if we can live up to that perfection in some way, we will attain the divine intention, the divine purpose that was put into us by God. That part isn't arbitrary. See, then of course immediately it means you can't make up your own morality. It means if man is made male and female for a certain purpose, you can't just rearrange the combinations as you please because you want to. There are a lot of people who think all ethics is just based on will. It's what I want. Anything I want, that's moral. Let's go down to the next point or two here. Ethics is based upon metaphysics, which I describe here as the bedrock of regulative principles determining all the other sciences of human conduct. Everything, as you know by now, many of you, everything reduces to metaphysics. Everything. In undergraduate courses, we used to teach philosophical psychology first. not because it was first, but because it was easiest to understand for the students. You got to distinguish between what's first as to the knower and what is first in itself. And what is first in itself is the science of metaphysics, because metaphysics is where we get our first absolute principles of every being. Being is, it is what it is, it cannot both be and not be at the same time and in the same respect. It has to have a sufficient reason for being. If it is not its own reason, it needs something else. These are the basic principles that govern all reality, including ethics, and including subatomic physics, which some physicists don't seem to realize. I say determines all the other sciences of human conduct. It determines all the other sciences, period. There are no exemptions or exclusions to metaphysics. And metaphysics, of course, metaphysics is where we also demonstrate by the 5 ways and other ways the existence of God and give some replete understanding from our perspective of God's nature, at least in reference to ourselves. So metaphysics also is absolutely foundational when you get into trying to determine whether an act is good or bad, because ultimately what you're seeking is the good, and the good is convertible with being, we learn in ethics. So every time you're seeking the good, you're trying to maximize being. You're trying to maximize the being of a situation. And you're trying to always act in such a way that you don't involve yourself in some kind of evil in the process of trying to maximize being and maximize goodness. What am I talking about here? I'm talking about the principle of double effect, which affects and impacts virtually every ethical decision anybody makes in the practical order of living. Ethics as a science aims at imparting art. What do we mean by art? What do you mean by art? What's that opposed to? We have art and we have prudence. Notice up at the top there, it refers to Higgins' book. The title is The Science and Art of Ethics. What do you do when you engage in art?
Organize.
Why do you one thing I always used to get tempted by, when I think of art, I think of painting something. But man's art is far broader than that.
Application of skills
To do what?
to at the end of the art.
Which is to do what? When you're engaged in art,
Create.
create what? You're making something. Art always aims at making something. We think of making a painting or making a sculpture, but we also make desks, we make automobiles, we make computers, we make buildings, we make symphonies, and we make our own lives. Ethics has to do with the art of making a good human being out of ourselves. That's what it's about. So it is an art. By science, we seek to understand. Notice the opposition, art and science. Science understands the truth. And we have to understand human nature in order to know how to make a good human being. And it's not arbitrary. It's not arbitrary because our nature is not arbitrary. We share a common human nature. And it is the study of that common human nature which will enable us to learn the principles that govern what actions should be taken in order to perfect the human being that has the human nature. So it aims at imparting art, the art of applying its principles, that is, ethical principles, to become skillful in producing good acts of will and of mind. And in the process, becoming a good human being. Because if you produce good acts of will, you will be acting morally correctly. I was wondering before I started this whether there was enough material to get a whole course out of it, because I haven't actually taught it for about 8 years. I'm beginning to see that there may be. The biggest problem, as I mentioned earlier, is that you really presuppose that you have students who have a background in philosophical psychology and metaphysics, at least. Because you need the framework. How can you study what's proper to man if you don't know where he fits into the world? And you have people trying to have courses in or studying ethics who want to do it right out of in a vacuum. No framework. I'm just going to decide what's going to be good. Pray tell, how can you do it? And no wonder on these talk shows everybody's got a different position. And no wonder why there isn't, on some of these talk shows, there isn't anything that you can advocate that doesn't have there isn't anything that anybody does that you don't find somebody advocating, no matter how horrible it is. There's always somebody out there who says, I'm for it. Well, I think it would be good for mankind. At least it'd be good for me. And you see, ultimately, so many times what we're talking about is things where people think something is good for them. They may be dead wrong, but they think what is ethical is what's good for them. And that you ought to respect what they want because it's good for them, and that they've got a right to have it. And you have no right to interfere with what they're doing. You don't even have a right to think that what they're doing is wrong. Heaven forbid. So you're hating them by thinking that what they're doing is wrong. So that we slide into absolute and total relativism. And we haven't got any way out of the bog because we've lost the initial principles upon which sound ethics is based. That's why I say, really, there's only one ethics possible, and it is what we call natural law ethics. It's sort of like what Dr. Waters frequently said about philosophy. Remember, quoting Leon Blois? There are only two kinds of philosophy. My French isn't as good as his was, so I won't repeat it. Those of you who are listening to this on a CD will simply have to buy Dr. Waters' CD in order to see how he explains it. Little reference here, little point, just before we close up here. I like this phrase, the natural metaphysics of human intelligence. The natural metaphysics of human intelligence. Man, by his very nature, has a certain grasp of being. And that's why little kids, even, you go up to them and try to tell them that a thing both is and it isn't, and they look at you real puzzled. What's wrong with you? What are you trying to tell me? My shoelace is tied or it's not tied? It's both tied and not tied. What's wrong with this picture, Daddy? Something doesn't make sense. Everybody has this natural inclination to understand certain basic truths, unless we really work hard to pervert them, to institutionalize their insanity. So we do have a natural certitude that some things are right and wrong in good human beings. In other words, we have a sense that it just isn't really neighborly to go around cutting your neighbor's head off. It isn't a nice thing to kill your own mother. Now, most people react negatively to this. And we know that that's an awful thing to do. We know that it's horribly wrong. Unfortunately, as society's morality degenerates, this sensitivity also degenerates, and people come to accept things that they otherwise would never have accepted. So in a certain sense, little children are in a better position sometimes than college students to understand what is right or wrong. The study of ethics converts this natural certitude to a formal certitude. In other words, what we're doing in ethics, you know instinctively that you shouldn't bite the hand that feeds you. Ethics will tell you why you shouldn't. Okay? Ethics will tell you why you have an obligation not to do it. Not just because that person won't feed you anymore. The pragmatist would say that. But ethics would say you shouldn't do it anyway, because it's just intrinsically wrong. So a lot of what we'll be doing in this course is to be converting things you already know, and you know you have to kind of resist. Be careful, because many of you have religious background and formation, and you've studied all your life about things that are right and wrong and so forth. We are not building this upon pastoral theology. We are not building this upon divine revelation. We are not building this upon the divine magisterium. This is what we're trying to do, is get an understanding from pure reason of what things are naturally right or wrong. It is unfortunate that in the debate that has arisen in our state about same-sex marriage, that much of it has been espoused in the name of what has been called sometimes Bible thumping. It has been based as though it was purely a matter of religious belief, because if it's just a matter of religious belief, we've been conditioned to think, well, that's just a private matter. It has no business governing the business of the state or society. Far better it would have been from the beginning if people had simply said that they had positions with respect to the nature of marriage that was based upon the nature of marriage and not upon divine revelation, and that some things are immediately evident, and that if we violate them, we will do grave harm to society. Perhaps even politicians could have understood that. Anyway, we'll return to that in the next class. Thank you.